My name is Grace Stone, and I'm 32 years old. The morning of our graduation ceremony, I ironed my gown twice, not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. My brother Liam and I were graduating the same day, different programs, same campus. He'd done his MBA. I'd finished my law degree. 5 years of late nights, ramen noodles, and borrowed textbooks. I remember thinking, sitting in that auditorium, that this was the day everything would finally feel equal between us. I was wrong. Dad sat in the third row. I could see the back of his head, silver hair, broad shoulders, that charcoal blazer he only wore when he wanted to look important. Mom was beside him, dabbing her eyes before the ceremony even started. My Aunt Renee was there too, recording everything on her phone. It felt like a celebration. It looked like one. But somewhere underneath all the folding chairs and polished floors, something was already shifting. The ceremony ended around noon. We took photos outside, Liam and me in our gowns, caps tilted, smiling at the camera. Then Dad said he'd made a reservation at Rosewood, this upscale restaurant downtown, to celebrate properly. I thought he meant both of us. I thought that was the whole point. We were halfway through the meal when Dad cleared his throat and set down his fork. That sound, that small, deliberate sound, I still hear it sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. He looked at Liam and smiled. The kind of smile I hadn't seen him give in years. Warm. Proud. Certain. He said he'd been thinking for a long time about how to set Liam up the right way. He said Liam had vision, drive, the instincts of an entrepreneur. Then he slid an envelope across the table. $1 million. Wired into an account he'd already opened in Liam's name. Seed money for the tech startup Liam had been sketching out on napkins for 2 years. The table went quiet for a second. Mom smiled carefully. Aunt Renee whispered something like, "Oh my goodness." Liam looked stunned, then grateful, then immediately comfortable with it, the way people look when they receive something they always, on some level, believed they deserved. I waited. I told myself there was another envelope. I told myself Dad was building up to something. I even picked up my water glass just to have something to hold. Then he looked at me. Not with warmth. Not with apology. Just flatly. Like he was closing a tap. He said, "Grace, you're sharp. You'll be fine. Go earn your own." And then he picked his fork back up. That was it. That was the whole thing. I don't remember finishing the meal. I remember the drive home. I remember sitting in my apartment that night staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood. That maybe there was a plan I wasn't aware of. That maybe this wasn't what it looked like. But I'd spent 5 years learning how to read language precisely, and there was nothing ambiguous about what my father had said. He had looked at his 2 children, both graduates, both on the same day, and decided one of them was worth investing in. The other one was on her own. What hurt wasn't the money. I want to be clear about that. I had a law degree. I had job prospects. I wasn't destitute. What hurt was the look on his face when he said it. Not guilt. Not hesitation. Just dismissal. Like he'd already calculated my value and arrived at a number he was comfortable with, and that number was 0. I passed the bar 4 months later. Took a position at a mid-size firm in the city. Worked 12-hour days. Billed my hours, paid my own rent. I told myself I was fine. I told my friends I was fine. I called Mom every Sunday and kept my voice even and said things like, "Work is busy and I'm doing well," because what else was I supposed to say? That I was quietly dismantling every belief I'd ever held about my family? That I'd started looking at old home videos just to see if I could find the moment where the imbalance began? Liam's startup launched 8 months after graduation. Dad attended the launch party. There were photos online, him and Liam in front of a branded banner, arms around each other, both grinning. I liked the post because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I didn't see my father much that year. Holidays mostly. And even then, it was surface-level food and small talk and the specific kind of silence that families build around things they've decided not to name. I kept my feelings folded and stored somewhere I didn't visit often. I told myself I was moving forward. I told myself it didn't matter. Then, about a year after graduation, my grandfather passed away. Grandpa Lou. He was 81, And he went quietly in his sleep, the way people who've lived fully tend to go. We all flew back home for the service. I sat in the third pew and stared at the flowers and thought about how he used to call me his iron girl when I was little, said I had a spine most adults never grew into. The funeral was hard. The days after were harder. Then came the will reading. And everything I thought I understood about my family broke open like something that had been waiting a long time to finally crack. The will reading was held on a Thursday afternoon in a small conference room at a law office downtown. Wood-paneled walls, a long oval table, Venetian blinds half-drawn against the afternoon light. I'd been inside rooms like that hundreds of times by then, professionally, I mean. But sitting on the other side of the table felt different. Smaller somehow. More exposed. We were all there. Dad, Mom, Liam, Aunt Renee, two cousins I barely recognized anymore. The attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Calloway, silver-framed glasses, careful voice, went through the standard items first. The house. The savings. Some personal belongings distributed among family members by name. Dad received the bulk of it, which surprised no one. Liam got Grandpa's watch, a beautiful old piece that Lou had worn every day for 40 years. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and told myself to just get through it. Then Mr. Calloway paused. He looked down at his papers, then up at me specifically. He said there was one additional item not listed with the general estate, a sealed envelope left with instructions that it be handed directly to me, and only to me at the time of the reading. He slid it across the table. My name was on the front in Grandpa Lou's handwriting. Shaky, because his hands had trembled in his last couple of years. But unmistakably his. I felt the room shift. I felt Dad's eyes move to that envelope. I felt Liam go still. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter, 3 pages, both sides. And clipped to the letter was a certified document from Grandpa's private account, a transfer authorization made out in my name. The amount was significant. Enough to change things. Enough to build something real. But I barely processed the number at first, because I was reading the letter. Grandpa Lou had written it 14 months earlier, 4 months after my graduation dinner. Somehow he'd found out what happened that night at Rosewood. I never told him. I don't know who did. Maybe no one, and he'd just known my father long enough to see the pattern without being told. He wrote that he'd watched me my entire life and that I was the hardest working person in our family, and that he was sorry I'd grown up in a house where that was treated like a reason to expect less from rather than give more to. He wrote that he didn't believe in punishing people for being capable. He wrote that he loved my father, but that he had watched him make a choice at that dinner table that Lou would not be repeating. He said, "Grace, the world will try to convince you that the people who need the least help deserve it most. Don't believe that. You earned this. Not because you struggled, but because you never stopped." By the time I reached the second page, I was crying. Not quietly. My shoulders were shaking and I couldn't stop it, and I didn't try. Aunt Renee reached across and put her hand over mine. Mom had tears running down her face, though she hadn't read a word of it. And then my father's chair scraped back. He stood up. His face had gone a deep, mottled red, the kind that starts at the collar and climbs. He looked at Mr. Calloway and said there must be some mistake. His voice was controlled for about 4 seconds. Then it wasn't. He said his father had no right to make private financial decisions without consulting the family. He said this was exactly the kind of thing that needed to be reviewed by an attorney. I almost laughed at that, sitting there as an attorney myself. He said Lou hadn't been in his right mind toward the end, which was a lie so transparent and so cruel that Aunt Renee stood up and told him to stop talking. He didn't stop. He got louder. He started pointing at the envelope, at Mr. Calloway, eventually at me. Said I'd somehow influenced his father. Said this wasn't fair. Said the word fair with a fury that would have been almost funny if it hadn't come from the same man who told me to go earn my own, while handing my brother $1 million across a restaurant table. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I picked up the certified document. And I looked at my father, really looked at him, the way I'd been too hurt and too stunned to look at him that night at Rosewood, and I said nothing. Because I'd learned by then that the most powerful response to someone screaming is to simply not. Let them hear themselves. Let the room hear them. He eventually stopped. The way a storm eventually stops. Not because it decided to, but because it ran out of something. I thanked Mr. Calloway. I hugged Aunt Renee. I walked out into the afternoon light and sat in my car for a long time, holding that envelope against my chest, thinking about Grandpa Lou calling me his iron girl when I was 7 years old. Thinking about how sometimes the people who see you most clearly are not the ones you expected. Thinking about how my father's voice screaming in that conference room was the first time in a year he'd directed that much energy toward me, and it took his own father choosing me to make it happen. I used that inheritance to open my own practice 18 months later. Small at first. Just me and a paralegal named Deb and an office with secondhand furniture and plants I refused to let die. It grew. It kept growing. And every morning when I unlock that front door, I think about a shaky-handed letter from a man who saw me when it counted most. I don't need my father's approval anymore. I stopped waiting for it somewhere between the will reading and the first time a client cried in my office because I'd gotten them a result no one else believed was possible. That feeling, that specific feeling, is worth more than any envelope.